So I wanted to start with a story, not about me, which sheds light on this terror, in fact, that we have of perfection. It's a story by Edgar Allan Poe, famous 19th century American writer, loved for his many short stories in this kind of noir mode. And the story in question is a story called The Oval Portrait, a very short piece that he wrote in the 1840s, which is narrated by a gentleman. I think you'd have to call him a gentleman traveller who's wounded, probably lost in a storm in the Apennines in Italy. And he needs shelter, and he finds a dark castle, which his manservant breaks into, because no one answers the door, so they kind of like break and enter so that he can find some shelter. And he finds his way up to an apartment in this castle, up in a tower, in a very dark room, which, when illuminated by the candles that his manservant, of course, he doesn't light the candles himself, when illuminated is a little bit like this room, just full of paintings. And even though he's exhausted, he can't stop himself looking at all these paintings. And then he retires to the bed in order to get a kind of panoramic view of the paintings, and finds a book on the bed. And this book is like a work of criticism. It's like an account of what all these paintings are. And in order to read the book, he takes the enormous candelabra to illuminate his text. And what he does is that he changes the kind of shadow structure in the room so that another picture becomes visible. And this is a picture which is in an oval frame. And it's a portrait. He's very struck by it. It's a portrait of a beautiful young woman. And he's struck by its kind of likeness. And he starts reading the account of the portrait, written by somebody who was aware of its, as it were, the creative process which led up to it, and tells about the fact that this was the artist's young wife. And it's a tragic story, because this was a very high-minded, serious painter who married this innocent young girl, and then proceeded to paint her. He painted her for months and months and months, and the more he painted her, the less fresh air and food and health-giving things she came into contact with. And she was stuck in this turret, being painted by this increasingly crazy maniac artist. Towards the very end of the story, I'm just going to quote from this story, the last part. But at length, as the labour drew near its conclusion, there was admitted none into the turret, for the painter had grown wild with the ardour of his work, and turned his eyes from the canvas merely, even to regard the countenance of his wife. And he would not see that the tints which he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him. And when many weeks had passed, and but little remained to do, save one brush upon the mouth, and one tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady again flickered up as the flame within the socket of the lamp. And then the brush was given, and then the tint was placed, and for one moment the painter stood entranced before the work which he had wrought. But in the next, while he yet gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid and aghast, and crying with a loud voice, "This is indeed life itself," turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead. So, I chose this ending of the story because it seems to illustrate, I think, several aspects of what we might call the aesthetics of perfection very nicely. Firstly, in the literal sense, it's about finishing a painting. It's very, very specific about these two touches, the tint on the eye and the brush of the cheek, which are the things, the two necessary details required to give the sense of now the painting is complete, now the painting is perfect. But it's also, I think, at least I hope something of this has come across, it's also a good illustration of what we mean by perfection, because it's a very well written story, such that when we read it, we think, well, I can't change that. I can't take these words and move them around and arrive at the same effect. The effect and meaning of the story is entirely bound up with the words being put in the places, with the intentions that Edgar Allan Poe gave you. So even when we come across details in the text, like there's a use of the word, the adverb, merely, quite near the beginning, which we normally use in a slightly different way. It says, and turned his eyes from the canvas merely, meaning not very often, not very much. And even when we fasten on that, we think, well, maybe our current audience wouldn't understand that. You can't change it. It's perfect, just the way it is. So, the third aspect of which I think this is a good illustration of the idea of perfection is that it associates in our minds, a quite long-standing suspicion we have towards the idea of artistic perfection. Namely that it's a kind of crime against life. If something's too perfect, it literally in this story, metaphorically, in the real world, sucks the life out of the real. And I think this suspicion is widespread, has deep roots, and there are a lot of traditions, artistic traditions, where I think the suspicion is acted against. So there are Japanese artistic traditions where imperfections are intentionally introduced to try and, as it were, humanize or get rid of this sense of the impropriety of perfection. Another example I came across the other day was of Karin Larsson, the wife of the rather famous Swedish artist Carl Larsson, who's very famous for painting his kids in his house, very beautiful, picturesque. His wife was also an artist and a weaver, and in all her woven tapestries and works, she introduced little imperfections, and that was allied to a kind of almost religious modesty. So one has this tradition. So this idea, and the second idea about perfection, I just wanted to cash out in terms of something which I think is better described in terms of the sense of necessity. So remember I was talking about this story, and of course it's a published text, and there are all sorts of laws about, well, you reproduce the text, and the author has decided, blah, blah, blah. All these things are a little bit like bureaucratic nowadays, but the meaning behind it is this idea that the author's intentions, creative intentions, are fixed when the work is complete. And we can't just go in and say, what's this word merely doing? I'm just really, really getting in the way. We've got to get rid of that and use a different construction which won't surprise the readers. And that put me, or connects, I think, very nicely to a passage in Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, where he's talking about what it means to understand language, what it is to understand a sentence in particular. And he writes the following: we speak of understanding a sentence in the sense in which it can be replaced by another which says the same. But also in the sense in which it cannot be replaced by any other. And it continues in brackets, any more than one musical theme can be replaced by another. In the one case, the thought in the sentence is something common to different sentences. In the other, something that is only expressed by these words in these positions. And he adds in brackets, understanding of power. Now I think we can, I hope, all easily relate to the different kinds of understanding he's referring to. The first is, I think, a very accurate and simply put description of just what it means to understand language. So we have a standard, for example, in writing dictionary definitions. If you use the word you're trying to define in the definition, you have somehow failed to define the term that you're defining. It's an error to do that, for the simple sense that you have a thought which has to be capable of being abstracted from its arbitrary expression in a linguistic term. You need to be able to get at that thought some other way. You need to be able to paraphrase the sentence. And if you think about it, well, if we couldn't do that, we'd have to kind of like bear all our words around us like furniture. You know, we wouldn't be able to abstract ourselves from them. Life would be incredibly cumbersome. But I think, you know, all of us here, presumably interested in music and art, will find ourselves drawn to the emphasis that Wittgenstein is putting on the second kind of understanding, where he says this other kind of understanding in the sense in which the sentence cannot be replaced, or the words in the sentence cannot be replaced by any other. And that, I think, it captures what I'm trying to get at when I talk about the sense of necessity. The idea that once the sentence is made, that the thought or intention or emotion or content of the poem, that's the good example he uses, becomes dependent for its existence on the sentence or poem being just the way it is. So you change it, and somehow this thought or intention just crumbles away. So my argument then, such as it is the following. This sense of necessity is, I think, as fundamental to human understanding as Wittgenstein was trying to suggest. It's also fundamental to art, in the sense that works of art have in common with individual people this condition of being individuals. They just are the way they are. And in order to relate to them and to understand them as such, we can't just go in and go around fiddling them. We need to take people as they are. And as any artist, and hopefully any decent critic, will be able to tell you that's also what you have to do with works of art. So the argument then is this sense of necessity is entirely fundamental to aesthetics and to art and to human interaction of all forms, moral life, I should say. But it's not to be confused with the idea of perfection in art that we often have. This idea of perfection which we are mistrustful of, this idea that art somehow sucks life out of forms of expression. So the trouble about this argument then is that these two things often are in practice I should argue, in fact, they're probably conflated more often than not in the discourse of art criticism. Because the idea of perfection, or let's say the experience of a work of art, or a musical performance, or a poem, being or appearing to be exactly the way it ought to be, is most easily explained and accounted for in terms of saying it's perfect. Everything, all the little features and ingredients add up to something such that our experience of it tells us that this is just the way it has to be. And that links very profoundly to the 18th century philosophies of aesthetics, which kind of ground the modern discourse of philosophical aesthetics. Perhaps best in the work of Immanuel Kant, who describes the kind of underlying condition which allows us to experience the beauty of art in terms of a perception in which we find that art imitates nature. It doesn't mean by that that the best kind of art captures how something really looks, always of trees or fields. He's saying it captures the sense of purposelessness, purposiveness is the rather annoying phrase, but it catches the sense of this is just the way it has to be. And he uses the example of a rose. Nobody's designed this rose, but everything about the rose is just perfectly the way it has to be. And the experience of beauty in this is a kind of intuition which puts us in tune, in Kant's understanding, with something like the divine order, the order of, underlying order of things, such that if we try and comprehend an entire natural system capable of containing forms of life in all its diversity, then it has to work damn well in order for everything to have the kind of flourishing that it does. So it's kind of that sense. And there's another, I think, even more ingrained way in which we appeal to ideas of perfection. Because once we've established, once we have like lines of criticism saying this, you know, often talk about the music, talk about Beethoven's symphonies. Okay. You can see very easily the way all the different components are put together, and it's all like one extraordinary puzzle being put together, which is exhilarating to experience life. And what we do is then we say, well, this is perfect, but not only that, it has enabled a whole new kind of world of artistic, emotional, human possibility. So historically, there's all these points in the history of art where, in critical discourse and art historical discourse, you're pointing to these perfect objects. You say, without these, not only are they perfect in themselves, but our entire way of understanding the world around us is contingent on them being exactly the way they are. So it's not just looking at the thing, it's looking at the implications of it. I think an easy way to understand that is perhaps just thinking about the history of chess or something like that, where you get the same kind of structure within a more compressed form, where if you know about chess and you know about the history of chess, you can point to the great games that took place where a new move was made. And it wasn't just someone trying out some new idea, but it was a move with implications that totally revolutionised the way everyone then came to play the game. And history of music is, in retrospect, just like that. That's the way it's written about. So, why is that wrong? That's the question. So I think, I'll try and keep this short. The easiest way to say it's wrong is by looking at actually what this spark of life is that we contend is endangered by perfection. And I think the best way to, maybe in this context, understand what this spark of life is in the germ of aesthetic perception as such. And I think a good way of trying to think about what that is actually thinking about how it usually, but almost always, and certainly originally, occurs at moments of the perception of imperfection. That is, when the thing that appears to us fails to correspond with the expectations that we have. Our own limited, inadequate understanding of the world around us suddenly proves itself to be inadequate, and the reality of the apprehended object suddenly. So a really simple example, I think like a grand thing, would be like a door. I don't know if you're like me, but doors usually work. You know, you go up, there's the door. But quite often, and this happens, I hope not just to me, you go to the door and it doesn't work. I need to get through to the next room. I'm supposed to be giving a lecture in this next room. And even though there's a big sign saying push, why is this door not opening? And it's a very trivial example, but it's the failure of the door to be what, without thinking about it, that causes you to look at the door. You take a step back. Push. And it's a good metaphor, I think, because literally what happens is you look at the door. Suddenly the door is there for you to see. And you open the door, and not to be too metaphysical around about it, but there is your brand new world, which is brought into being by your perception of something being just the way it is. And obviously with a door it's all a bit arbitrary, but I think art works like that. So the image I wanted to conclude with, if I can conclude, is very often referred to kind of exemplar of perfection, which is the pearl. The pearl. And a good use of the word culture. We use this word culture in all these different contexts, effectively meaning the same thing. But the pearl is cultured by the oyster. And what is the pearl? The pearl is imperfection. It's a piece of grit in an oyster, which causes the oyster pain and trouble. And it sits there, and the amazing thing about it is you take it out and adorn yourself with it. And it's a beautiful pearl. But there's a thing about that pearl, which is it wouldn't be as beautiful if it wasn't for the suffering of the poor old oyster who produced it. So I think I'll leave it there. I've said more or less what I wanted to say.